Well, pretty soon the Sunday school classes for all of our young people will be looking at the conversion of Saul of Tarsus to Paul the Apostle. That's one of the, in more ways than one, the most brilliant moments in the New Testament that we could ask for. And we thank God for the chance to present it to the children. Oh my heavens, bless your heart.
I didn't actually find what you wanted because I wasn't sure.
Oh, this is wonderful. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, that might do very well. So, next to the life of Jesus, which of course needs to wash everything we know about people in the Bible, and especially in the New Testament. The conversion and life of Saul of Tarsus become Paul the Apostle might be the next highest. Now, not that we want to be too comparative, because Saul of Tarsus, Paul the Apostle, was a sinner like the rest of us who needed to be transformed. But learning about his conversion and learning about his life tells us a whole lot about what happened in half the narrative of the New Testament, and laid the foundation for the kinds of things that were happening across the whole world that made it possible for Christianity to be spread from a local sect of Judaism around the area of Jerusalem to a worldwide faith that's transformed people through 20 centuries across the whole globe. And I would venture to say that of the human evangelists, Paul the Apostle might have been the most influential in all world history. Now, Billy Graham in the 20th century, and I think most of us know Billy Graham, preached to more people maybe than anyone else in world history, and took the gospel to more nations. But I still lift up the Apostle Paul, because he worked harder to cross the lines of more cultures and more nations, and took such risks at a very tender time in the development of Christian faith and its conversation with the world, that he might have been the most influential evangelist to make possible that the Western world could know about Jesus. This is a big event. It's one of the biggest events in the history of Christianity, and apart from the life of Jesus himself, possibly the biggest event in turning a life recorded in the New Testament. So, yes, I'm glad that we're looking at this in Sunday school, and that our boys and girls are having a special opportunity to look at it in earnest in their experience as well. So, let me tell you a few things, and of course what I assume when I do these presentations, that my role is to equip adults and Sunday school staff to be effective in communicating these events to the boys and girls. So I may present them in ways and on levels that you don't want to mimic necessarily. You might in some cases, but that you can take into your own memories and hearts to make you effective as you communicate those things to the boys and girls. That's the goal. So I won't follow line by line the outline of the study guide that you have. I have reviewed it and it's really good. I'm going to touch on much the same material from an original, if you will, approach to those things. So first I want to talk about Saul of Tarsus, who he was, where he lived, what his background was, that made him the kind of man he was. Because if you know the story from the book of Acts, the first time we hear about Saul of Tarsus, he is guarding the clothes of the men who decided to stone Stephen. That's the first time he shows up in the New Testament. He doesn't say anything, he's just helping the guys who were there to stone Stephen. And he approved of that. He thought that was a good thing. How could he think that, we might say, as Christians? Well, I want to talk about his background a little bit. We don't have to approve of what somebody does to make valuable understanding where they come from. And maybe understanding with a certain kind of appreciation where they come from. We need to do that with everybody we witness to. Anybody who hasn't met Jesus Christ yet and known his transforming power is carrying a load of human experience with them. And if we have no interest in the load that got them to where they are before they meet Jesus, we may not have the compassion to help them cross the divide and become disciples. Jesus was a bottomless pit of compassion for sinners. Now, he didn't approve their sin, but he had a bottomless pit of compassion for what their plight was and what they needed to be rescued from, cured of. He had that. That's what made him so effective. When he was able to rescue the woman caught in adultery, there's no implication there that he approved of adultery, quite the opposite. But he certainly had a heart for that woman. And he saved her life and sent her with a fresh incentive to live that life that had been ransomed for her, free of that sin forever. So, I want to think with you about the life of Saul of Tarsus. And the first thing I want to remember is his origin. The nickname, Saul of Tarsus, tells you a little bit about where he came from. Tarsus was a town, and I'm going to use this Bible atlas to help bring it home with you. I hope that you can recognize this part of the world. The land of Israel that we usually see blown up in Bible maps is here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Italy is here, Greece is here, what we call Turkey is here, and the land of Israel actually is a strip of land on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, just southeast from Europe. And where Saul of Tarsus grew up was in a town that was just off the corner, the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. And it's a well-defined corner. It actually has an inlet of the sea there. This was the homeland of Saul of Tarsus. That's where he was born. That's where he grew up. It's not very far from Antioch, which is also in that same area. Antioch, you might remember, is the town where the church got situated, and it says in the book of Acts, where the believers were first called Christians. For our Eastern Orthodox friends who have some of the earliest roots of all Christianity, save the book of Acts itself, they often say, we came from Antioch. And they invite their folks whom they share the gospel with to come with us to Antioch and start your journey in Jesus from there. Well, Tarsus and Antioch were pretty close places. And of course, at the time that Paul was growing up, Antioch was not a cradle of Christianity yet because Jesus had not gone to the cross yet when he was a child. But that's the area that is his home. But what we also know about Saul is that he spent a lot of time growing up steeped in the Jewish faith because he made the journey from his homeland down to Jerusalem. And in his own autobiography, part of which is found in Acts 22, he tells us that he sat at the feet of the great Jewish teacher Gamaliel. Gamaliel was on the Sanhedrin at the time of the beginning of Christianity. Gamaliel, you may recall this story when the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem wanted to silence once and for all the disciples in one of the early chapters of Acts. Very interesting. Gamaliel was the one who stood up and put everybody out of the room and made a plea to leave the disciples alone and not persecute them anymore. And what he said was, we have examples of people who rose up and started a sect and it burned out because it was not of God. In this case, I tell you, leave these men alone. Because if they are of themselves they will burn out like all the others. But if it is of God, you won't be able to stop them, and you might find yourselves at war with God. That was Gamaliel. He was in one of the early chapters of Acts. I want to say that it was Acts chapter 5. If it's not chapter 5, it's very close, but I think it's Acts 5. Saul, by his own autobiography, tells people in his testimony that he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, that may have laid a foundation for him later to understand the vitality of Jesus Christ, but at the time, he was simply learning Jewish faith and Jewish philosophy, and he was probably one of the most educated of Jewish men in his day. He was born in Tarsus, a Roman citizen by birth, but a Jew by faith. Not all Jews had that privilege, but Saul of Tarsus did. So he was born into some privilege and some opportunity for education and thought and faithfulness. He grew up steeped in that, so much so that he left his home and traveled probably a couple hundred miles, and in those days it would have been like thousands of miles to us, to sit at the feet of Gamaliel and learn some of the deepest teachings in the seat of Judaism, Jerusalem, that he might get it right, what it means to follow God faithfully. Now, as Saul became an adult, he chose to become a Pharisee. Now, most of the time when Christians in Sunday school hear about Pharisees, they hear about prideful people that are walking around pointing their fingers at people and condemning them. Not that that's really untrue, but it's a really shallow impression of what Pharisees were. We learned from some historians of the first century that the Jews in Jerusalem had a tendency to identify themselves with different groups. We might call them parties. You might even make an analogy to political parties today. I don't want to push who was which. I just want to say that there were two main groups of Jews in those days, Pharisees and Sadducees. Most Jews identified with one or the other of those groups. The Sadducees were strict by the letter of the law people who said if it isn't in the books of Moses, we're not beholden to it. They were pretty practical, no-nonsense folk, and a lot of them were landowners and influential folks. And then on the other hand, you had the Pharisees who agreed that we need to honor the law of Moses and his teachings, but the Pharisees were the group of Jews, a large group of Jews, I should say, who believed and looked for the coming Messiah, who believed in visions and angels and the revelation that could come from angels, new revelation, to build upon that of the law and the prophets. They believed in heaven and hell, which are not explicitly taught in the Old Testament. So the Sadducees would have nothing to do with that. The Pharisees believed in heaven and hell, a last judgment, a coming Messiah, and in preparing yourself to get to heaven. So if we learn more about Pharisees than what we learned as children in Sunday school, we could realize part of why Jesus had so many conversations with the Pharisees, some of them heated, were because that was probably the group of Jews that he had the most in common with. The Sadducees didn't want to hear about the kingdom of heaven or the Messiah or heaven and hell or a coming judgment or a life after this one. They weren't interested. So Jesus had very few conversations with the Sadducees. You don't hear much about them. They're there. You hear about them here and there in Jesus' teachings, but by and large you don't. You hear a lot about the Pharisees because he had so much in common with them. They looked for all those things. Paul grew up a Pharisee. He believed in heaven and hell and visions and angels and the coming Messiah. He believed in all those things. The two places where Jesus and the Pharisees disagreed with each other in the Gospels were two key ones. One was, how do you get to heaven? Because the Pharisees believed, as most practical Americans do, that you get to heaven by the merit system. If you do more good than evil, you'll have a good score and you get in. What's your credit rating with the Lord? You know?
Credit card.
Yeah. And you can boost your credit rating by doing so many good deeds. You know? That was the Pharisees' understanding of how you get into heaven. And the Messiah was someone they were yet looking for. Jesus comes and says, you don't get into heaven just by the merit system. Yes, you uphold high moral standards, but you have to recognize that you can't get into heaven with a scorecard. And there are a lot of, and Jesus said, I'm eating with sinners and prostitutes and tax collectors and all these people that you say you'll be stained just by being in the same room with. They're going to get into heaven before you do. That blew the Pharisees apart. They thought it was crazy talk, and they would have none of it. So Jesus made the Pharisees angry by saying you get into heaven by surrendering your life to the only one who is righteous enough to get you there. And then, before it was all over, Jesus said, and that one is I.
Jaden's going home to get ready for his thing.
Thanks. So when Jesus spoke and he said, not only are you wrong about how you get into heaven, you need a Messiah, and I am he. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Actually, much more than a straw. When you say, it is I, you've made a tremendous claim that is either absolute craziness and misleading folk by the millions, or it's the truth. And everybody who decides to follow Jesus is making that against the grain, counter-cultural choice to say Jesus is the one. Those 2 points are where Jesus and the Pharisees parted ways. That's where Jesus and Saul of Tarsus parted ways. Nobody was more zealous for being close to God than Saul of Tarsus. Nobody had expended more of their energies and their passion for figuring out, both mind and heart, how to get closer to God than Saul of Tarsus. He wanted to get it right. He wanted all the people around him to get it right. He wanted people to get close to God, and nothing would make him more angry than to think that somebody was taking them on a journey to hell. And in all the teachings he had had in his formative years, and in all that he could gather as a faithful Pharisee, he understood that Jesus was one of those false teachers who was leading people to hell. Now, I don't think we're here today thinking that Saul of Tarsus was right, but I hope that you can profoundly appreciate his heart. Would that people across our land today had half that passion to be close to God. Even if they get it wrong, if they're mistaken about some things, to even care. Sometimes it's easier to talk to folk about faith who are engaged in a faith, even if it has errors in it, than it is to talk to vast swarms of folk who really don't give a rip about God. Saul of Tarsus was passionate for God, and he would do anything to spare people the danger of missing out on him. He brought that to the table. That's why he was standing there guarding the clothes of the men who stoned Stephen. You may remember the teaching of Jesus when he said to the disciples, don't you worry, don't you be scared about the people who can kill you. You're in God's hands, faithful ones. What you need to worry about is people who can take your body and soul into hell. That's what to be afraid of. Guard yourself against that possibility. Don't let that prospect ever enter your life. Beware most of all the folks who could lead you astray and rob you of your salvation. That was a teaching from Jesus himself. And that was a passion that Saul of Tarsus shared. The issue was that Saul of Tarsus at that point in time was convinced that Jesus was one of those folks who could lead them astray. And so he thought one of the greatest services you could do is eliminate a voice that could lead people to hell. He thought that Stephen was one of them. And he thought that all the people who were following this new sect, this cult if you will, this Jesus cult, were all putting at risk people's lives that they might end up in hell. And anything he could do to stop that from happening was a help to the cause of God. And so yes, he approved the stoning of Stephen, because at that time he was sure Jesus and Stephen and all people of similar ilk were dead wrong and would lead people to eternal death. It was in that spirit then that he went to the chief priests and said, will you give me the authority to go to the Jewish community up in Damascus so that I can purge them of this Christian heresy? And he had enough expertise. He was an extremely educated man. And he had the fervor, the charisma to get it done. The Sanhedrin, the priests in Jerusalem, were thrilled to be able to send him to help stomp out the way before it catches like a cancer over in Damascus in Syria. And so they gave him the authorization to go to the synagogues to work with the Jewish community there. At that point in time, the Jews were the only ones who were really wrestling with whether Jesus is Lord. Most of the pagans weren't at that time. And so he went to work networking with the synagogues. Now again, if you look at where he went, which is something on the scale of 100 miles northeast of Jerusalem, it's not so terribly far from Jerusalem by modern standards. You could drive it in a couple hours, but you remember every hour we drive is probably about 3 days' journey. So it was more than 1 day's trip from Jerusalem to Damascus, and that by beast of burden. If you're lucky, it's a horse, because he's the fastest. It might be another animal that's not quite so quick. Paul had a horse, I believe. And so off he went to Damascus, and on his way, a wondrous thing happened. It came from nowhere. I'm going to read from Acts 9. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He asked, who are you, Lord? That single line, a prayer. It's a prayer. It's a conversation with the Almighty. Lord, who are you? Actually, the Lord spoke first. Why do you persecute me? It was a prayer that the Lord started. Conversation with him. And Saul replies, who are you, Lord? Now this is interesting because you know that Saul of Tarsus knew the name of Yahweh. He couldn't have gotten to where he was all those years if he hadn't known the name of Yahweh. And what he sensed in that moment from the gut, from his soul, was that he was talking to the Lord, but it wasn't a message he expected to be hearing. And he, while knowing that it was Lord, couldn't tell quite whose voice he was hearing. He was at once amazed, overwhelmed, inspired, and confused. This is a holy moment in all the New Testament when Saul of Tarsus is on his knees before the Lord, whose name he's no longer sure of. Who are you? I can tell you the Lord, but why do I not recognize your voice as someone I know? Breathe that moment in, and you're richly blessed. And the reply is, I am Jesus. I hope you sense the profundity of what is connecting and reconnecting here in this holy moment. he is completely at the mercy of the Lord, whom he thought he knew so well and was serving so much. And now he's not sure who he is and asks his name, and he hears Jesus. You know how that blows you away? Can you imagine what it is like when someone hears that the husband or wife that they sent off that morning in confidence and security has been instantly killed in an accident? Or what it's like if someone who knows that their dear one has been dead for some time gets the news that they have not been dead but have been found alive somewhere. Your whole frame of reference is blown away in a breath. And everything you understood as reality has to be reassessed. This is what was happening with Saul of Tarsus in that very moment. I think only someone who's lost a loved one that they thought was fine, or someone who's found out someone's alive that they were sure was dead, would have a grasp from experience of what that feels like. It probably would have taken something just like this. The mind of God knows best of all. It probably would have taken something just like this to rewire Saul of Tarsus, because he was so ingrained, so impassioned about faithfulness, and so sure that he had it right, and so sure that that sect that was growing out of Jerusalem was wrong. It probably would have taken a reorienting trauma like this to give him the place in his mind and heart to reconsider Jesus. That was what Jesus gave. Knocked off his horse, blinded in the light, heart to heart, face to face with the very one. Why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus. The experience of meeting Jesus is transforming. Anyone who's lived in depression or sin, that's eating at their life and drowning their soul and discovers Jesus Christ, knows that transforming experience. I am Jesus. And maybe some folks who come to know Jesus in just as transforming, just as profound a moment, maybe they have all kind of background about religious truths. Maybe they have none. But what they all have in common is, I may not be able to explain everything. I may not have the details. I may not be able to say what truths were clear to me before or what truths are becoming clear to me now, but the orientation of the truths that I put together from now on are based on, this is Jesus. This is the Lord. And every perception and every explanation and truth that I have from now on is going to have to be built on this thing that I have come heart to heart crashing against, that I know to be true, whatever else I have to sort out. I know this is true. I've got to orient my life from now on, my understanding of what's good and evil, of what's true and false, of what's worth living and dying for. I've got to build it on this thing that I simply cannot deny. I have met him. I have felt him. He is real to me. He is my Lord and my best friend. And whatever else I figure out about my priorities in life, it's got to be built on this, because there is no life without this. That's Saul of Tarsus. Another man in the Bible that came to understand that, I believe, was in John chapter 9, the man born blind. When everybody was arguing about who sinned to make him blind from birth, and Jesus said that's not the whole point at all. Well, you forget that and just know that God is using his life to manifest his power and goodness and love in the world, and Jesus heals him, and all the people come around and try to explain why and how and whether it was a good idea or a bad one because it was done on the Sabbath, and he's surrounded by all these judges and Pharisees and folks who are going to say, come on, tell the truth, tell the truth. You think he's a prophet or you think he isn't? And a man born blind, now seeing, is able to look these guys in the eye and say, I don't know the answers to your questions. Here's what I know. I was blind, and I can see, and it's because of him. We've got to appreciate the profundity of a heart-to-heart, face-to-face encounter with Jesus Christ that changes your life and places the rock on which you're going to build all of the truths for which you live in the future upon. He has Saul's attention. I am in Jesus who you are persecuting, but get up, enter the city of Damascus, you'll be told what to do. That was enough for now. He probably couldn't have comprehended much else anyway. But he's blinded, so he has to be led by the hands to go into Damascus and sit and wonder what to do with this experience he's had. They led him by the hand, it says, brought him to Damascus, and for 3 days he was blind, and he wouldn't eat or drink. Remember we talked about earlier today about fasting. When you fast, you become dependent on God. You are most vulnerable and dependent on God to shape and protect your life. So whether he chose to do that fast or whether he just couldn't bring himself doesn't really matter much. It could have been either. It prepared him to be reshaped by God. Now we have this secondary story that is a part of the main one, and that's the story of a man named Ananias who lived in Damascus. Now the difference with Ananias was that sometime in his life, his recent life, he had given his heart to Jesus Christ. He had to have been a Jew. He had a Jewish name. Those were the only people that really were in touch with Jesus up to then. And I guess there are some exceptions to that, but by and large, it was a Jewish experience to follow Jesus. And the Lord comes to Ananias and says, I want you to go baptize Saul of Tarsus. And Ananias says, what? You asking me to die? Everybody knows what kind of man this is. Everybody knows what he represents and what he intends to do to anyone who follows you. And you want me to go baptize him? Are you asking me to sign up my death warrant? And the Lord says, go, because he's an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before the nations and kings and the people of Israel. Now the difference between Ananias and Saul of Tarsus at this junction in time was that Ananias had been converted previously and had learned to be utterly dependent on the Lord, to be willing to live and die for the Lord. And if the Lord told him to go baptize Saul of Tarsus and it was a death sentence, then he was going to go anyway because he knew he owed the Lord his life. Oh, he argued about it. Well, so Jesus brought up a concern in Gethsemane too that we don't fault him for. It's okay to say, what are the stakes? What's going on here? To ask those questions of the Lord in an honest conversation often equips you better to do it when the time comes. And Ananias' advantage was that he already knew his life depended on Jesus. And even if it meant going to his death, he was going to obey because he trusted the Lord who had saved his life and who had a plan for the salvation of the world. So Ananias, maybe reluctantly, but willingly nonetheless, found Saul of Tarsus. And it's a beautiful little moment that I think many evangelists and pastors long for. He put his hands on Saul and said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. And he got up and was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. So many things that make this event and the things built on it possible and powerful. And if any of those pieces had been missing, maybe that would have become a house of cards and fallen somewhere, but it didn't. Saul of Tarsus listened, and he was prepared. Ananias listened, and Saul was baptized. And in the seasons to come, we don't know when he became better known as Paul. It wasn't by the end of Acts 9 when he gave his first testimony, an invitation to Jesus in the synagogue in Damascus. They wanted to kill him. His name at that point was still Saul of Tarsus, but later he became known as Paul. A name that implies much more humility and certainly a complete transformation of identity. I hope you appreciate anywhere in the Bible that someone is known for their name and their name changes. There is a lot more power in a name in the biblical culture, especially the Jewish biblical culture, than we may have today, where names are often given because somebody's second cousin had that name, or their dad, or their granddad, or their mom, or their aunt had that name. Lots of times we borrow names from other languages and cultures, and we're not even sure what they mean. You have to look them up somewhere. But the name sounds nice, so we use it. And then we wonder why we have so much trouble remembering somebody's name. Because in the Hebrew culture, your name had a lot to do with who you were. Your name described who you were. Jacob the grabber, Abraham the father of nations. Your name told people who you were. And so it was easy to remember because those things were interdependent. I might know your name, but I don't know you in English. But in the Hebrew, if you know somebody's name, you've learned something about their life. And what that implied for a lot of folks was that if you do know somebody's name, you have some leverage because you know something about their life and you have authority over them. Instinctively, we can sense that when we call somebody, little kid's out playing too long and we say, "John, come in for supper." John goes on playing. "John, come in for supper." "John Richard, you come in now." And in comes the kid in a hurry because they hear their name formally pronounced. That's an instinctive thing that we even carry with us, even though we didn't grow up in the Jewish culture, where having a name implies power, identity, and having a connection and an authority with that identity. That's exactly what was going on in that great powerful moment in the Old Testament when Jacob let all of his possessions go before him and he was alone at night. Jacob the grabber, who had cheated and swindled everybody and made his living out of that, and found himself wrestling with the angel. And at the climax of that wrestling match with the angel, if you remember, Jacob seemed to prevail, but ultimately didn't. And the angel said, "What is your name?" What does that mean to us? But it meant life to the angel. "What is your name?" "My name is the grabber, Jacob." "Well, I'm going to change your name." We read it and say, "So what?" To the Hebrews, they shuddered because it meant a life was ending. Identity is being taken from someone. Your name is no longer Jacob. Your name is wrestler with God. That's what Israel means. Wrestler with God. For the rest of your life on earth and beyond, you're going to be known as the one who strived with God. And all your people and all the heritage who take their name and heritage after you are going to be known as strivers with God. And they're going to hear the name that tells them who they are. The name Jesus, we say it so crisply. The name Jesus is a derivation of the name Joshua, and it means he saves. That's his identity. It's not just the syllables, it's his identity. Saul of Tarsus is no longer Saul of Tarsus. The more he lives, the more he witnesses, the more he is known in the world, He is known as Paul, the Apostle. And Paul the Apostle, in physical weakness, which that name Paul implies, points to utter dependence on the strength of Jesus. It is his new identity, and God changed it. And that's why this man, raised in the area of Antioch, raised in Tarsus, a Roman citizen by birth and a Jew by faith, learned in all the languages needed of the day to speak Hebrew to the Jews and to write in Greek to the world, became God's tool through which the foundation for world Christianity was laid. This is big stuff. And friends, when you think about identity and purpose and destiny, your name, who you are, when turned over to Jesus, is redirected forever and becomes, maybe not to the same scale, but to the same glory, directed to the cause of the gospel. Let's know everything we can about such changed lives as this one, and let's manifest it in all that we undertake forever. Amen.